Hey friend, today's episode is going to feel different from what I usually talk about. And I want to warn you of that up front, not because what's coming is hard to hear, but because I don't want you to come in expecting one thing and feel thrown off when you get something else. Today is Good Friday, and this isn't a day I want to talk about strategy. It's not a day for frameworks or downloads, what's working or what's not working. Those things will be here next week. They'll still matter next week. But today is not that day. Today, I want to slow it down, where I want to sit with you in something that doesn't resolve quickly, where I want to resist the pressure to wrap everything up neatly and instead just stay in the room with you for a little while. Because here's what I've been thinking about this week. Good Friday is the day everything looks finished. Jesus is on the cross. The disciples, the ones who left their nets, walked away from their families, who had spent 3 years believing that this was it, that this was the thing, they're scattered. They're hiding. They're grieving. They're trying to make sense of something that just doesn't make sense. And nobody knew that Sunday was coming yet. Nobody woke up on Friday morning and thought, okay, this looks terrible. This is bad, but it's okay. We just have to make it to Sunday. But they just live the Friday in real time without the ending. And I can't stop thinking about what that must have felt like. The silence of that day, the weight of it, the way hope can look completely gone and somehow still not be. So that's what we're doing today. We're sitting in the Friday together. And friend, I want to tell you why I think that matters more than maybe you might expect. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. I want to take you back into the story for just a minute because I think we read it so fast that we miss what we would have actually felt like to be inside of it. So think about who was there. Peter, who 3 years earlier had left his fishing boat the moment Jesus called him. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't go home and think about it. He just left. Because something about this man made him feel like the life he was already living wasn't the life he was supposed to be living. Mary Magdalene, who had been set free from something so dark she could barely remember what the before felt like, who had followed him since Galilee, because where else would she go? Who had seen things that couldn't be explained in any other way. The disciples, they watched him heal people, who had been there when he fed 5,000 people with a child's lunch, who had watched him walk on water and then remarkably watched Peter do it too, at least for a moment. These are people who had seen things, who had built their entire understanding of what was possible around this one person. And now he's gone. And not just gone, executed publicly like a criminal. In the most humiliating way the Roman Empire had designed for people they wanted to make an example of. From where they stood, this wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. They had followed the right person. They believed the right things. They had done what they were asked of. They had left everything. And this is where it ended? On a Friday afternoon, on a hill outside of the city, front of a crowd. And here's what stops me every single time I sit with this story. They didn't know that this was part of the process. We do. We read this story knowing what happens on Sunday. We know the tomb is empty. We know the ending. We've heard it our entire lives. We sing about it. We celebrate it. But for them, this wasn't Good Friday in any sense of the word. It wasn't good. It was devastating. It was confusing. It was the kind of grief that makes you question everything you thought you knew about God and your calling, and whether any of it was actually real. It was just Friday, a terrible Friday that just didn't make any sense. John chapter 19, verse 30 says, When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. It is finished. 3 words that on that afternoon must have landed on the people who loved him like a door slamming shut. Because when you're living inside of a moment like that, you don't have access to what it means. You only have access to what it felt like it was over. It was wrong. They probably felt like we were sure about this. And now we don't know what to be sure about anymore. And I want to bring this a little closer to home now, because I'm not talking to you today as a professor of theology or a pastor or even someone who has it all figured out. I don't. But I'm talking to you as someone who has had her version of Friday, just May of 2025. I know what it feels like to be inside of a story that just doesn't make sense yet. And I'm sure you do too. We've all had our versions of this, where we sat with questions of whether any of this was real, what were we going to do now, while still trying to keep showing up for it. And I want to name something that maybe you are carrying right now. Not because I can see your situation specifically, but because I talk to enough of you to know that for many of us, this season is heavy. And heavy doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes heavy looks like waking up and feeling that low-level anxiety before we've even checked our phone. Sometimes it looks like doing all the right things and still feeling like nothing is moving the needle. Sometimes it looks like going through the motions of a life that looks fine on the outside while quietly wondering on the inside if this is really what you're supposed to be doing. And for some of you, not all of you, but some, that thing might just be your podcast. You started with something real. I know you did. There was a moment. Maybe it was a conversation you had or something you heard that finally put language to something that you had been feeling for years. A quiet nudge you just couldn't explain, where you felt like, okay, this is the moment. This is the thing I'm supposed to do. So you did it. You bought the microphone, figured things out, recorded those first few episodes with your heart in your throat. You hit publish when everything in you wanted to wait until it was better. You showed up. And then weeks passed and months, and the numbers didn't look the way you thought they would. And the podcast started to feel like less than a calling and more like an obligation. Or someone in your life made a comment that planted a seed of doubt that you can't quite seem to pull out. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the question started. Did I get this wrong? And I want to sit with that question for a minute because I think it's a more honest question than we give it credit for. Because that's not a faithless question. It's a human one. I'm sure the disciples asked it on a Friday afternoon. They probably didn't say it out loud, but I would guess that it was there. You can feel it in the text, the way Peter denied him 3 times, in the way they all scattered, in the way they went back to fishing after the resurrection as if they were trying to return to something that made sense in their life. Doubt in the middle of a hard season doesn't mean that you missed your calling. It means the work is real enough to cost you something. It means that you're actually in it. You're not just talking about it from a safe distance. Psalm 22, verse 1 through 2. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? I cry out by day, but you do not answer by night, but I find no rest. Those are David's words. They're also the words Jesus cried from the cross. The question of abandonment is not a sign of weak faith. It's a cry of someone who believed enough to be devastated by silence. If you're in a season where God feels quiet and your calling feels uncertain and the thing you built feels like it might not be working, you are in very good company. And I want to be really intentional here because I've sat through enough sermons and listened to enough podcasts and read through enough devotionals where this is the part where someone says, but God, and everything pivots to easy encouragement. And I'm not going to do that because I think that one of the most disrespectful things we can do to someone in a hard season is sprint past their pain toward the resolution. It communicates, even if it's unintentionally, that what they're feeling is a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be sat with. So I want to stay here a little longer before we move on. Good Friday is a day that is theologically uncomfortable because it asks us to hold two things at once that don't naturally go together. I think it asks us to believe that God is good, and He is, and that sometimes what God allows feels like abandonment. I think it asks us to trust that there is a plan and to acknowledge that from inside the plan, you often cannot see it. It asks us to have faith and to have that faith tested in the exact place where it matters the most. Jesus didn't skip the cross. He went through it all the way through. And the theological weight of that is something I don't want to flatten into a motivational quote because I believe that it's way too important for that. So here's what I want to say carefully and with clarity. If you're feeling that quiet in your life right now, it does not mean God is absent. The slowness in your podcast right now doesn't mean that you got your calling wrong. The confusion you're feeling about what's next doesn't mean that you've been abandoned. Because on the day everything looked finished to everyone who was watching, not just to the people who had given up. To everyone. There was no visible evidence of anything other than an ending, and something was happening that nobody could see. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." All things. Not just the things that make sense, not just the things that feel productive, not just the things that we can easily explain, but all things. The Fridays, the slow seasons, the years where the numbers didn't reflect what you were putting in, the conversations that felt like they landed nowhere, including episodes where maybe you had to record in the driveway of your house because your house was too loud and you weren't sure anyone was even listening. All of that is in all things. And you're allowed to feel the tension between those two things. Like my friend Lisa Whittle says, the hard good, right? But I want it on the record that God hasn't looked away from anything that you or I are building, even if it doesn't feel like it. Good Friday holds an invitation that we spend most of our lives trying to avoid. The invitation to be in the middle without rushing out of it. We're not good at this. As people, as a culture, as believers even, we want resolution. We want the quick fix. We want the third day version of every story, and we want it by Saturday morning at the latest. We fast forward through lament in the Psalms to get to the praise at the end. We skim past the wilderness to get to the promised land. We want the Sunday story on Friday afternoon. But the disciples didn't get that. They had to live through Saturday. And I think Saturday is the most underpreached, under-discussed day in the entire Easter story. Yep, I said it. Because Saturday is the day where the tomb is sealed and nothing has happened yet, where the hope is buried and there's no evidence it's coming back. When you have to get up and put your feet on the floor and just exist in the not knowing, Saturday is where many of us are living right now. So if you are in your Saturday, you are not behind. I think seasons that feel like they're going nowhere are often when we're doing the deepest kind of work. Roots go down before branches go out. Formation happens underground before it shows up on the surface. And the things God builds in us in those quiet seasons, the patience, the dependence, the willingness to keep going without the external validation, my friend, those are not wasted. They become the substance of every sustainable thing you'll build on this side of heaven. But you don't get to see that yet. And I know that's hard. Lamentations chapter 3, 22 through 24 says, "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him. That was written by Jeremiah sitting in the rubble of Jerusalem. The city had fallen. The temple was destroyed. The people he loved had been taken. There was nothing around him that even resembled hope. And in the middle of all that chaos, of all that devastation, he wrote one of the most quoted passages of comfort in the entire Bible. Not from a place of resolution, but from a place of ruin. The faithfulness he was writing wasn't visible to him in that moment. He was choosing to name it anyway, not because the evidence was there, but because he knew who God was enough to trust him even though the evidence wasn't there. And that is a very different kind of faith than the faith that's easy. And if you're in a season where that's the kind of faith that's being asked of you, I want you to know that it's not a lesser faith. It's actually the deepest kind. So here's the thing. I have watched people build things quietly for years with almost no external encouragement. There was no viral moments. There was no sudden growth. Just week after week of showing up for the person on the other side of the microphone. And I've watched those same people get messages sometimes years later from a listener who says, I found you when I was at the lowest point in my life. And I don't know if you know this, but your episode, your content, your message helped me. You don't get to see that on Friday. You don't always get to see it on Saturday. But that doesn't mean that it isn't coming. So, as always, I want to end with something practical. Not a framework, not a list, just one thing. I want you to stay. That's it. That's all I've got. I don't want you to rush ahead to fix the season that you're in. Don't force a breakthrough that isn't ready to come. Don't make any major decisions about podcasts, your calling, your direction, your life choices from a place of Friday afternoon. Saturday is not the time to rewrite the story. It's the time to stay in it. The disciples didn't do anything dramatic on Saturday. They gathered, they sat together, they tried to make sense of something that didn't make sense. And they waited, even though they didn't know they were waiting for anything. And that's the invitation here. Keep showing up. Keep being faithful to the small, quiet, absolutely unsexy work of creating something for someone who needs to hear it. Keep recording even when you don't feel like you have anything profound to say. Because sometimes the most important thing that you say is just, I'm still here. So keep going, even when it's slow, especially when it's slow. Because what feels like an ending is sometimes the setup. You don't always get to know the difference while you're in it. And that's not a failure of your faith. That's the nature of faith. Galatians chapter 6, verse 9 says, Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. The proper time, not our time. The time that makes sense in light of everything God can see that we can't. The conversations he hears. I believe that verse was written to people who were tired, not to the people who had given up, to the people who were tempted to, people who were doing the right things and not seeing the results and wondering how long they were supposed to keep going. And the answer is, then and now, don't stop, because the harvest is real, even when you can't see it yet. So friend, Good Friday is not the last word. It never has been. But today, I want to honor it for what it is. A day of wait, a day of questions that nobody had the answers to yet. A day that looked like an ending and was quietly, invisibly, the beginning of the most important thing that has ever happened. So if you are in your Friday today, in your life, in your calling, your marriage, your relationship, even your podcast, I want you to know that I see you. And more importantly, the God who lets his own son go through all that he went through, the cross, and then raised him out of it 3 days later, he sees you too. This isn't the end of your story, even if it may feel like that today. So thank you so much for joining me on this very special episode of Christian Podcasting Secrets. Remember, you can love Jesus and analytics, and life is way too short for boring podcasts. I'll talk with you next week. Happy Easter. Sunday is coming. Bye, y'all.